50% of the fish catch in developing countries comes from small-scale fisheries, which makes them important to both food security and the economy.
Millions of people are employed all along the fisheries value chain, on board fishing vessels, cleaning and processing the catch, and marketing, export, and sale. Thus, seafood is both valuable to global trade and a lifeline for local communities.
In 2014, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations endorsed a set of guidelines to protect and enhance the impact of small-scale fisheries around the world. One of its main objectives is the sustainable development of small-scale fishing communities.
First, this requires a recognition of the unequal power relationships along the value chain. For example, women play a crucial role in fisheries post-harvest activities, but several factors undermine their participation.
To address this, the guidelines recommend that the appropriate amenities be provided to ensure their occupational safety and well-being. A lack of capital, knowledge, and infrastructure often prevents small-scale fishing communities from earning their fair share from the seafood trade. The guidelines recognize that building capacities can improve access, enhance livelihoods, and ensure the safety of our food.
The United Nations Sustainable Development Goals envision small-scale fishing communities gaining access to marine resources and markets. Associations and cooperatives can give voice to fishers and fish workers' interests in decision-making. Keeping this in mind, traditional forms of association should be recognized, promoted, and modernized.
States should also promote trade in small-scale fisheries products by introducing beneficial taxes and tariffs and simplifying paperwork, inspection, and other norms. The guidelines also recognize that unregulated fish exports can deepen inequality, threaten food security, and deplete fish stocks. Sound policy and better fisheries management can help avoid such market-driven overfishing.
Sustainable practices all along the value chain can help avoid losses and waste by combining traditional, cost-efficient methods with innovation and new technology. For example, value addition can be promoted to improve livelihoods and prevent overfishing.
Timely information and fair certification standards can fetch higher prices and help small-scale fisheries adapt to changes in global and local markets. By empowering each actor in the small-scale fisheries value chain, we can ensure that the benefits from seafood trade are shared with the poor and vulnerable communities, thus safeguarding their rights and the sustainability of our fisheries.
Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining Blue Venture's Toko Telo series. Thank you all for your attention and presence today at this event, Fair Finance for Small-Scale Fisheries, Supporting Sustainable Fisheries Management Through Improved Earnings. I am Chris Giordano, Technical Advisor for Value Chains and Markets at Blue Ventures. Toko Telo is a Malagasy term for 3 stones that hold up a cooking pot. It is used in Madagascar when multiple stakeholders, interests, and backgrounds must come together and share with one another to achieve something that no single group or perspective could achieve on their own. Without each rock, you cannot cook because your pot will fall down. So without each viewpoint, we can't achieve the best outcome for every party. That tradition is at the heart of this event and why we have invited 3 experts who will be forming our panel today. During the first live-streamed half of the event, they will present, followed by a questions and answers session, where the audience will have the opportunity to submit questions. To ask a question, please use the YouTube comments if you're watching on YouTube, or the question and answer box if you're joining us through AirMeet. Please ensure your questions to the panel are concise and relevant to the theme of this event, and feel free to type your questions throughout the panel presentations, and we will collect them to put to the panelists after the 3 presentations. Please note that all the comments made this way are public and are attributed to you. The panel discussion will draw out 3 approaches to connecting finance to small-scale fisheries. As the speakers present, we invite you to reflect on what has or has not worked in your experience to achieve fisher access to fair finance and equity within value chains, as well as what tools could be used to achieve that goal. Those insights and reflections will enrich the question and answer session and strengthen the next section of our event. After the panel, there will be breakout discussions where we have the opportunity to build on the strong foundation and information provided by our panelists. And if you forgive the metaphor, cook up a delicious discussion about fairer finance for small-scale fisheries. In the breakout rooms, you will be able to use unmute and camera buttons at the bottom and the chat box. We would like to create a place where everyone has the opportunity to voice their opinions and ideas, so please do contribute to allow others to contribute as well. If at any point you encounter technical problems, please send an email to digital@blueventures.org. Our staff is there to help you out during this event. At the end of the event, there will be a short feedback questionnaire sent out, and we would really appreciate you taking a moment to fill it in. That said, I'm delighted to introduce you to our panel today. From Future of Fish, we have Laura Fernandez-Cascan, Director, Blended Finance and Business Innovation. From Blue Ventures, Esther Nugure, a Technical Advisor for Mangroves and Blue Carbon, is joining us. And finally, Neil Inamdar, Principal at Wilderness Markets, will be closing out the presentations. Before we start their presentations, I wanted to take a brief moment to reflect on why we selected this topic for Toko Telo. For almost 2 decades, Blue Ventures has supported coastal communities to develop locally led approaches to marine conservation that benefits people and nature alike. Over that time, we've developed a scalable model for catalyzing and sustaining marine conservation, unlocking the potential of fishing communities to protect our ocean. However, we noticed that scarcity, specifically uncertain fishing income, limited the ability of fishers and fish workers to absorb the opportunity cost of conservation. While the economic, cultural, and environmental values of marine resources may be recognized, frequently these marginalized actors lack the capital to survive a temporary fishery closure or a fluctuation in seafood demand. Providing access to finance, especially fairer finance that aligns with the voluntary guidelines for securing sustainable small-scale fisheries, is critical to overcome the upfront costs of effective fisheries management and conservation. We need to ask ourselves if current trends towards investment in the oceans are accessible and redress historic unequal distributions of power, as well as what innovations are needed to make it so. There are hundreds of millions of traditional fishers and fish workers in remote and rural urban communities around the world. With the right support, they can fundamentally reshape our relationship with our oceans. They can rebuild their fisheries, strengthen their livelihoods, increase their well-being, and improve their food and nutrition security. They can restore ocean life and sustain healthy, resilient environments for generations to come. So now we pass on to the presentations. First to speak is Laura Fernandez-Cascan, Director, Blended Finance and Business Innovation at Future of Fish. She specializes in analyzing and structuring projects to support social innovation and environmental impact with social entrepreneurs, grassroots organizations, and value chains, combining a range of financial instruments. Laura, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks for having me, and it's a pleasure to be with you all today and sharing our learnings and ideas on how unlocking finance. No? Today, what I'm going to share is a working framework on how we are approaching this challenge at Future of Fish, and especially link it to our projects in Peru and Belize. So our Future of Fish, who we are, well, this presentation is going to remain there, so it's a bit longer, but it's going to be shared. So hopefully I can pass quite faster. We are an NGO and a non-for-profit that works mainly with alliances and applying systems thinking and co-designing solutions with seascape actors, applying human-centered design, and in order to contribute to the creation of data-rich fisheries that are more sustainable and also build resilience in the communities. Why is so hard to get finance? From our perspective, there is a mismatch among the finance sources and those that seek and need finance, no? And especially when we talk about private capital and return-seeking investments, and we are talking about non-mature small-scale fisheries, no? There are non-standalone solutions. We need to focus on investable entities, and that implies building revenue streams. And it's all about, when we talk about finance, it's all about risk management, no? And we need to identify those risks and define strategies to manage those. So our challenge and what we are facing more when we are talking about working in small-scale fisheries is there is lack of funding, a strategic funding that is catalytical in both upfront and long-term or patient capital. Our finance framework is as a working framework, as I mentioned, is a framework of thinking and how we can approach this, applying that systems lens, systems thinking, and working with, in co-designing with stakeholders in the field, especially. It was built when we realized that this discussion is out there. There are not many solutions of success stories in the small-scale fisheries and finance for small-scale fisheries. And at the same time, there are many reports, and lately there have been a lot of work in defining potential solutions, instruments, and mechanisms. Some of the work also done here with colleagues from Blue Ventures and Wilderness Markets, no? And we realized that there is also a lack of understanding from the field, from the grassroots organizations, and mainly the NGOs, no, and how to approach in this. So that is why we created this framework and how we could work it with our alliance, with our allies. We built our framework with thinking on that blended finance and integrated landscape management, and this implies bringing approaches of investment that are already working in other sectors and in agriculture. And the integrated landscape management works more in thinking, designing to solve multiple objectives and manage expectations within the landscape, in our case, the seascape, and not only thinking about fisheries or the value chain, but what other things are needed in the territory, and how the coastal communities interact in that territory, and how to structure the finance, blending those resources in order to generate returns, reducing risk, leveraging capital, but also increasing impact. Our framework at the end seeks to transform capital for systems change, underpinning the blue economy. So that's why we apply this systems lens and thinking beyond the fishery. No solution fits all, no? And this, as I mentioned, there is a mismatch. This and what we with this slide is a graph where we summarize that that mismatch between the types of capital and profiles of investments. And sometimes we want from the field to seek for return, seek investments, whereas we are not ready yet for that. So in this slide, in the left side, we have what are the enabling investments, the type of money that we need to look for when we are in a mature fishery where there is a lot of risk. And this is our focus more in setting the foundations, the enabling conditions, and the system level research. Whereas we move towards the right, we will be working more in the readiness of the investable entities and looking for operation and assets or CapEx investments within a specific entity, business, or solution. So we need to be aware of what type of instruments and sources we are seeking, depending on the return, the risk, and the maturity of our fishery and the phase in which we are. So this is, I want to highlight pretty fast our framework of thinking. As I said, is about what we are suggesting is to think in 3 blocks. The first one is mapping the system, and mapping the system in order to evaluate the maturity of the fishery that we are working with, but also how our entity or our project or our targets of investment are interacting within that system and how mature they are. And of course, doing that, assessing the conditions to unlock investment. And we recognize 3 conditions. The first one is the fishery system enablers, which are related to the governance and management of the system itself, the controls and the regulatory frameworks of that system, and the capacities to manage it. The drivers for engagement and impact that are related to those motivations and incentives related to the seascape beyond the fishery, and is more about how to promote healthier ecosystems, communities, and businesses. Is thinking beyond and thinking more in that seascape and how everything interacts. And last but not least, the requirements of investable entities and projects, and it's all about assessing the readiness of our entity and project in order to pass through a due diligence of an investor. The next step is thinking about the elements for our strategy, and we suggest when thinking about this how to unlock finance to the fishery, right, within that seascape lens, we think about 3 elements. The first one is the levels of engagement, that we suggest 3, but maybe there are more. One is the umbrella level that is related to the national, regional, and international institutions. The second are the phases of investment, that is more the readiness, preparation phases, and the return seeking phases, and the landscape levers that are more related to how to match the mandates, the goals, and the risks and needs of investment with the investors, in opening the scope of investors beyond the traditional investors in the fishing sector. And the third one, the third element of the framework is building the solution, taking all the tools that we have and iterating this framework in order to design a model and define the model and the structure of the investment, and getting to the facing all the barriers that you may encounter that are more related to, or at least what we face are more related to the numbers, and getting the data in order to conduct the feasibility and determine what are the specific financial needs of the vessel owners, if our target are more the vessel owners or the co-ops or a specific investable entity. And last, I wanted to highlight that the framework closes thinking about not only financial capital, but also about the social capital and finance culture as key management and risk mitigation tools to ensure the long-term sustainability. So those are critical conditions, are critical to achieve the conditions to unlock investments. No, so what we do is normally thinking, working together with our stakeholders in the seascape, in order to create those enabling conditions, whereas we work in define the potential marketing and finance solutions that we promote.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you very much. And I apologize that we weren't able to fully get to the Belize case, but I'm hoping that at least in the question and answer session, we might be able to dig in a bit deeper there. And speaking of the question and answer session, please remember to type your questions throughout the panel presentations, and we can collect them and put them to the panelists after the 3 presentations. Second to speak today is Esther Nigure. Her role at Blue Ventures entails refining and scaling up Blue Ventures' Blue Forest model and driving initiatives that help to unlock climate finance for coastal communities, focused on community-led conservation. With a background in corporate finance for 5 years, Esther brings on board her expertise in building viable financial and business models to the mangrove ecosystem. Thank you, Esther, for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks a lot, Chris. I'll be focusing on the mangroves and blue carbon context for cross-sectoral learning. And Matt, if you could, thank you. So, what are mangroves? Mangroves are dense coastal forests that cover the planet's tropical and subtropical belt. And they offer a number of ecosystem benefits to coastal communities, such as acting as nurseries for coastal fisheries, providing a source of fuel wood and timber, and protecting coastal people from extreme weather, such as floods and saltwater intrusion. But then, above all, mangroves have a very unique ability to store staggering amounts of carbon dioxide, sometimes up to 4 times faster than terrestrial trees. And this carbon stored in their natural sinks is what we call blue carbon. But then mangroves are being lost at devastating rates worldwide, and human activities cause at least an estimated area equivalent to almost 20,000 football pitches to be lost each year. And if this destruction continues, then it's going to worsen the climate emergency that we're already facing. Financing mechanisms for mangrove conservation and restoration are available from different sources. And these sources include philanthropic contributions, there's private sector partnerships, there's government funding, e.g. through RED programs, and through some organizations such as the UNFCCC, and also through locally raised funds. And finally, most recently, through payment for ecosystem services, e.g. tourism, user charges, and for our case today, blue carbon. So blue carbon, by the virtue of it being measurable and standardized, has been adopted and is now being traded in voluntary carbon markets. And this is traditionally done using a carbon standard. And the main standards relevant to mangroves are the Verified Carbon Standard, so VCS, and Plan Vivo. There are other standards that can be used for mangrove restoration, but these two, so VCS and Plan Vivo, are currently the only ones applicable to mangrove conservation. And what the standards do is they usually provide the methodologies, guidelines, and requirements that project developers must follow in order to register a project under that standard. And once a project is registered or validated under that standard, then it's able to sell carbon offsets on the voluntary carbon market that are verified by the standard body. And one common misconception is that because mangroves store a lot of carbon, then you can have a carbon project anywhere. But this is not the case. In order to sell carbon offsets, a project then needs to prove that their activities have either prevented CO2 emissions, that's conservation, or they've caused more carbon to be stored, that's restoration, compared to what would have otherwise happened without the project. So what would have happened if business would have continued as usual. And here at Blue Ventures, we believe that coastal communities are often the best place to manage and restore nature. And this is because they have the most to gain from conservation success, but then they also have the most to lose from collapsing mangrove forests and fisheries. So working with coastal communities to restore and protect mangroves then makes financial and climatic sense. But then in order to halt mangrove loss, then those cutting the trees need a more attractive incentive in order to leave them standing. And in order to make community-led mangrove conservation or rehabilitation possible, the funds provided then need to offset the opportunity cost of mangrove conservation. And this opportunity cost is actually the income that the community would have otherwise earned from cutting these mangroves. So for example, through aquaculture, agriculture, or charcoal production. So we have a case study here called Tahiri Honko. And in 2018, Blue Ventures, in collaboration with the Velondriac Association, which is a community management organization based in the Bay of Assassins, southwest of Madagascar, launched the Tahiri Honko project. Tahiri Honko means preserving mangroves in Malagasy. And this is a first in Madagascar, and it's verified under the Plan Vivo standard. This project helps to tackle climate breakdown and build community resilience by restoring and protecting mangrove forests while bringing sustainable economic benefits to local people. And it's contributed significantly to the science required to make community-led, rights-based blue carbon projects a reality. And it also goes to show that with the right support, coastal communities can restore their forests and strengthen their livelihoods and improve food security. But as things stand, very few coastal communities are benefiting from the finance that's on offer for conservation. There are only a handful of blue carbon projects globally because of some barriers that hinder fair blue carbon finance. And some of these barriers include, number one, policy. So blue carbon policy is often opaque and complex in most countries, and land tenure and carbon ownership rights, which are very critical for the success of a blue carbon project, are often not well defined. Then number two is the costs. So here we are referring to the costly scientific assessments that are necessary for a blue carbon project and are often a cost that's prohibitively higher for smaller community projects. And number three is inequality. So carbon projects are typically only eligible for support from carbon finance schemes when they can demonstrate that management is already in place. So they require upfront financing to develop these conservation efforts. And then lastly is co-benefits. So most of the current carbon finance schemes do not place sufficient focus on the multiple carbon and non-carbon benefits of sustainable mangrove management, and this would incentivize integrated marine management. So lastly, what is being done or what could be done to address some of these barriers? So one, we have strong social safeguards to protect coastal communities, which some verification standards are already doing, e.g. the Plan Vivo standard, which already has a guideline, a requirement that not less than 60% of a project's benefits should go to communities. Then number two, we can recognize mangroves for all their benefits, so carbon and non-carbon benefits, and quantify the diverse ecological and social benefits of mangrove conservation to incentivize an integrated marine management. We can harness advances in monitoring technologies and recognize indigenous knowledge to enable communities to access climate finance in an accessible and equitable marketplace. And we can also have innovative finance mechanisms such as blended finance. And lastly, an adjustment of carbon prices is needed in the voluntary carbon market. So currently, nature-based solutions often range between like $8 to around $14, and this does not actually recognize the efforts that go into successful conservation projects. So I've come to the end of my presentation. Thank you so much. I'll hand it over to Chris.
Thank you, Esther, so much, and very insightful and very interesting. I know quite little about blue carbon, so I was very pleased to hear your presentation, the explanations there. If there are questions for Esther, please put them into the chat box on YouTube or on AirMeet, and we will be taking those questions, collecting them, and putting them to the panelists during the upcoming Q&A. Finally, today, who we have closing our panel is Neil in Namdar. He has a background in conservation finance and has been exploring the development of sustainable finance tools for marine resources and fisheries. Neil works with a broad cross-section of funders, investors, industry, and community groups to overcome environmental and sustainable resource utilization challenges. Thank you, Neil, for joining us today, and I pass you the floor.
That's great. Thanks so much. So part of this, well, a big part of my presentation is some work we did a couple of years ago, which Blue Ventures asked us to present. And it's available on our website, Collecting the Dots. And I appreciate the opportunity to share it all with you. So if we just move on, a lot of folks on this call, I imagine, are familiar with the typical value chain frameworks, extending from at the resource level down to the end markets, and the need/role of investable entities in those frameworks. This is classic USAID style value chain material and the relevant analysis that oftentimes goes along with it. Go ahead. Most of the interventions that we tend to focus on are either firm or market level upgrading strategies. So at the markets, we're looking at some form of differentiation. And then at the firm level, we're looking at cold storage or production, et cetera. And we try to bring that down as much as possible to the base of the supply chain which is essentially where we meet up with our fishers and the local communities. And a lot of the work is focused around building their capacity to engage in this value chain. And as we've all experienced, or most of the folks who've experienced doing this work, we sort of hit a limit in terms of the extent to which we can affect change, both at the community level and also at the resource level, if we solely focus on these two strategies. Go ahead. So building on the issue of stock health, we took a look at the literature and also working across a range of fisheries from Indonesia, Eastern Africa, a lot of Latin America, and in the US. Really looking at what are the component drivers of stock health and how that integrates and how that influences the value chain. So as many of you are familiar, there's alternative tenure mechanisms going beyond kind of the traditional quota or share models that need and are being experimented with. There's also costs associated with those, whether it's the design and implementation and all the way across to the management and monitoring. And the challenge that we've had traditionally is these tend to be off of one side, and we later come to trying to define or design how they integrate with the value chain. So if you go to the next slide. So what we sought to do was see how this all works together. And this is something that we tested and continue to test. And would welcome feedback as well as opportunities to develop this framework further. Typically, the health of the entire value chain is driven by stock health, but oftentimes the interventions we propose either don't address the costs of achieving stock health, or in some cases exacerbate the challenges associated with stock health. In the cases of where we are implementing solutions that don't, in the case where we're implementing solutions that don't address the costs or the nature of stock health. So being able to think about these two elements within this context, we found to be very helpful and useful when designing solutions. If we go to the next slide. So one example that we worked on fairly extensively was in Indonesia. And based on this, I'm going to use some old data. And obviously, it's probably changed in the last 3 or 4 years. But just for the illustration, when we look across this, we can see that the majority of stocks that were being targeted were in trouble. They're either red or yellow in the context of their viability and in context of their the extent to which they've been targeted. Now, granted, Indonesia, we can talk about data and data collection, but for purposes of this conversation, we just wanted to share that in this context, the challenge really is how to moderate tension with the rate of offtake for the majority of stocks, and do it in the Indonesian social, political, and cultural context, trying to achieve what has been termed fair capital. Next slide. So this is just a summary of what we found. We can go on. There's really 3 major categories of investment that we identified in that model. There's management, there's infrastructure, and there's enterprise. And the understanding of the shift and the extent of investment in those 3 components is really relevant and important to being able to define the capital requirements and then how they get repaid, either through the value chain or through some form of investment mechanism. To the next slide. So this basically just lays out against the value chain the different components, and you'll get the rest of these slides because I see we're running out of time, with the types of interventions. And the important thing to note is in the case of Indonesia, the government and others had done a significant amount of work to try to address these challenges. And so the mapping of those resources as well as those interventions against the value chain helped the various participants identify the requirements and the interventions that might help them solve this issue of access to finance for small scale fishers. And I'll stop there and happy to answer questions in due course.
Thank you so much, Neil, and a very interesting framework that integrates many different approaches, and I'm glad to see that it was applied and tested out, and to hear that you're still iterating on it as well. We're now passing to the question and answer section of the first half of this event. So will my panelists please join me up here? All right, thank you. Hi, Laura. Hi, Esther. It's nice to see your lovely faces again. We are, as a quick reminder before we begin these questions, some are coming in, is that at least on AirMeet, you need to go, you need to click on messages in the top right, and then go to either the chat or the question and answer section, and we'll be able to see those questions there. Starting out, we have a question for Laura that says, how are you putting the framework into practice? What barriers have you found when designing solutions?
Thank you for that question. We are putting the framework into practice in 2 countries, in Peru and Belize, with different approaches. The one in Belize, there is a huge momentum there with all the blue economy and creative finance. And we are working in piloting and improving some concepts for both the stakeholders and the funders, and more related to traceability and market improvements and optimizations, and working in the strengthening of the cooperatives in order to bring or access to funding that is going to come through impact investors and the blue economy creative finance. No? And in the case of Peru, we are focusing in 2 targets. One is the communities and financial education and financial inclusion, which opens up a new type of investors and institutions to work with. And also we are working with with anchor firms in developing trade finance in order to access both for working capital and CapEx investments on technologies on board of the vessels, no? And that doing through, again, pilots that are already ongoing in the field with grant money, but in order to prove the concept, and the main barriers are related to data and measuring the risks for every single partner.
Thank you, Laura. Our next question is for Esther. In the carbon market, how does the funding mechanism work? What are the important stakeholders in the mechanism, and what is the role of coastal communities in the carbon market?
Okay, so how it works, I could give it a go using the example of Blue Ventures and the Tahirihonko project. So what happens is a community has an interest in having a carbon project, and sadly, due to the complexity of the carbon standards and the audits and preparing the project papers, then they opted to do it in collaboration with a technical advisor, being Blue Ventures. So the Velondriac Association and Blue Ventures came together, identified the area that they would like to conserve the mangroves, and opted for the Plan Vivo standard. So Plan Vivo then does annual audits, and after 4 years there's also some comprehensive audit that is done. And what happens is, after it's validated that you have actually taken done the activities, so conserving the mangroves and restoring the area that you specified that you will restore, then the carbon calculations are done, and your project is validated under that standard. So after that, in our case, the Tahirihonko project generates at least like 1,300 around 1,370 tons of carbon. So they're then listed in carbon registries. So that's another stakeholder, the carbon registries. So there'll be an example I can give is the American Carbon Registry, the Marquette Registry. And on that, then companies or individual buyers or brokers can then approach Blue Ventures as a technical advisor with the price quote and request for price quotes and all that, and you will quote certain tons for them depending on their demand, and that's how it works. So after that, then the money is disbursed, and using the benefit sharing agreement that was discussed at the beginning of the project, then the funds will be shared, some to government, some to the community, and some to take care of the activities, so the monitoring and reporting. But then, sorry to go over time, but the role of coastal communities in this case is to actually undertake the activities, so to conserve and to restore the mangroves. And also, they also do some patrols to ensure that everyone in the community is actually obeying in Madagascar, it's called the DINA, so the community agreement that they made in the first place. And yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Esther. We do have a follow-up question for you, but I know, Neil, you have some experience working with blue carbon, so I wanted to know if you had any insight or comments to add about how the carbon market mechanisms work, or what are the important stakeholders there?
Sure. I think, I mean, Esther's covered most of them in the context of policy, land owning, tenure, all those kinds of questions are some of the critical issues. And in the absence of those, then the legal checks around the actual ownership of the mangrove and the carbon that is resulting becomes an issue. And often in places like Kenya, there's riparian land issues where the land is essentially set aside and it's not titled and it can't be titled. So addressing those, I think, is one of the fundamental considerations for assuring or securing title to the credit that is ultimately being generated.
Thank you, Neil. The follow-up question, Esther, is essentially community mangrove carbon projects have been around for a while, but among very few communities living adjacent to mangrove areas. Why do you think this is so? And thank you, Joan from Kenya, for asking the question.
I think some of those barriers that we covered in the earlier slide are actually the most major problems that are causing there to be very few projects that are in existence, the main one being policy. So carbon is a highly politicized issue in most countries, and the policies are mostly opaque or vague, and it's hard to place mangroves either maybe under the forestry ministry or under the I don't know, maybe the water or ocean management. Like it's usually very complex, and sometimes communities will not know how to deal with some of these issues. And even being that mangroves are mostly in most countries owned by the state, and there's probably a rule for no cutting, and it's being done illegally, and there's a lot of issues that surround the mangrove industry, and that's why there are very few projects. But the trend is kind of changing, with blue carbon being a highly demanded product now in the voluntary carbon markets, and there are technical advisors or NGOs and like other companies that are trying to support coastal communities to develop these projects. And then I think also there's some complexity in like development of like the project papers and all that, and communities often have to depend on third parties to actually help them interpret and develop these papers. And then the monitoring technologies sometimes are also expensive, and all this has to be in place before a project can then be able to sell carbon credits or be able to register with the standards. So yeah, most of the time communities actually usually require someone to kind of hold their hand and provide this upfront financing to ensure there's governance in place and all these things are in place, and then they can be able to register a project.
Okay. Thank you so much, Esther. From Sophie Binbo, we have a question for both Neil and Laura. I'm wondering, Laura, could you go first, and then Neil follow up? But she says that both of you have mentioned a number of barriers to accessing finance, improving value chains, or upgrading entities. If you had to pick one, what do you think is the main barrier to success?
Well, I would say thanks for that question. There are many ones. I'm going to talk more in the small scale fisheries and mature fisheries, so that for our the main barrier are those enabling conditions. No, so getting upfront finance for those to build those enabling conditions, and also get the data in order to modeling the mechanism or the financial solution.
Thank you, Laura. Neil?
I'm actually going to push back against this thinking of picking one main issue. I really think that's a challenge in this space. You know, the best way I can describe is it's frankly like pressing on a balloon. There are multiple issues that come into play, and they're all interrelated. So picking just one and trying to focus on that, I think, would be a problem, frankly.
Thanks, Neil. And building on that question, and also Esther, I kind of want to open this up to you as well, as the lack of investable entities is one of the largest barriers to channeling new investment funding into small-scale fisheries. Have there been any successful strategies from your experience for increasing the investability of those entities? Neil, why don't you start?
Sure. I think some of the good examples that are out there are really tied to mechanisms that assure stock health. So, you know, the classic one is the lobster fishermen off of Mexico on the Pacific side. They have there's a lot of literature around them, and they historically tied their benefits and the viability of their entity to the availability and health of lobster, which they were able to access to good markets. There's other organizations like Smartfish and others that are trying to do the same kind of thing. But they are few, but there are some good examples for us to learn from that are tied to stock health.
Thank you, Neil. Laura?
No, I would agree with Neil, definitely, and that comes back to that point on the enabling conditions. No, those cases are built on that quotas. No, yeah, I would say that as my point in the presentation, no, and those strategies that work for me also work on that social capital. So they are built in working the conditions of the leadership and the governance within those investable entities, no, and that is key for the success of the solution.
Thank you, Laura. Esther, at least with mangroves and carbon markets, are there any strategies that possibly could be applied to fisheries for increasing the investability of different institutions?
I think maybe I need some time to think about it, but something that came to my mind when Neil was speaking was about investable entities, was the nature of the SSF industry being very fragmented. So you find like so many fishers, and probably without a consistent framework, and probably there are aggregators, there are brokers, like all this probably could also be an issue that is maybe a condition that needs to be addressed in order to have investable entities, because I think for an impact investor, they'd need to de-risk their investment. So who is going to be held accountable once they provide an investment and need return at some point? Yeah.
Thank you, Esther. Our last question comes from South Africa, Serge Raymakers from Abelobi. He was wondering if our Neil or Laura specifically could share some examples where impact investment has deployed in the value chain to upgrade, value chain upgrading, pardon me, myself, in small-scale fisheries. Specifically, he wants to kind of dig into the idea of where things are at the beginning of the project or the investment, and what should someone expect a time frame to be, and potentially any key lessons that there are. It's a large question, so you don't have to answer all of it, but whatever perhaps pops out to you as the most intriguing or section of it, and we can leave the rest of that question perhaps for our discussion after the or at least our breakout groups.
Go ahead, Laura.
Thank you, Neil. And thanks for the question. It's a very interesting question, and it's the key, no, of all of this. I would say beyond the cases that Neil highlighted before that had that type of investments, I was thinking in two strategies. One, working with anchor firms, and I know that is because the tickets, the bigger tickets of impact investors sometimes. So I know some examples on firms that are approaching to impact investors in order to flow that money to the value chain. But I would like to highlight another one that is a firm, a small firm that is getting, it was more seed capital at the very beginning, but now it's in the scale up of the entity. That is a company in Guatemala that is working with tuna and is building a win-win strategy with the small scale fisheries, and the communities, and they are getting also financing from impact investors, and I would say that is in a growth stage, of the company.
Thank you, Laura. Neil.
Yeah, I guess so. From our experience, we've kind of looked at 5 kind of key pieces: product value, stock recovery cycle, infrastructure access, supply chain length, and then the organizational homogeneity and capacity as kind of being our key critical indicators for is small-scale fishery intervention going to succeed. There are few examples that have really scaled. I think Laura mentioned one, Smartfish is another one. The Integradora project, Integradora folks are some of the other ones. Typically where we see them trip up is around organizational homogeneity and capacity. We can solve for a lot of the other ones, including stock health, with the appropriate tools. But if we don't have a cohesive group willing and able to work in the supply chain, that becomes an issue. This is, again, why we kind of compare it to a balloon rather than a one solution takes all.
Thank you, Neil. So this concludes, or this question concluded our question and answer session for our panelists. And now we're moving into the breakout sessions. To join a breakout group, all you need to do is find a seat at the table which matches the language group you wish to join. To do this, click a seat next to the table of your choice. Because of attendance constraints, the tables will prioritize a specific language, but our facilitators will help support translation if needed. We have a French, English, Bahasa Indonesian, and Spanish tables available. The discussion or the breakout session will last around 35 minutes. And once your table is filled, the session will start. So thank you so much. And I hope you enjoy your breakout conversations to dig deeper into this and other questions, perhaps a bit more of Serge's question. Thank you so much.